Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Pittsburgh Sports Memories podcast. I am Tim Hannon.
And I'm Steve Wirt.
And as always, we are going to delve into a Pittsburgh sports memory from the past. Today on the show, we are going to be covering the 2016 Pittsburgh Penguins championship run. Anytime we cover a topic, especially a championship season, we always delve into sort of the background leading up to that season. And I think in this case, it's really relevant, maybe more relevant than any other time we've done this because, Steve, there's been 16 championships won collectively by the three professional sports teams here in Pittsburgh. And I'm not sure that any of them are quite like the one that the Penguins won in 2016 because I don't know if any of the other teams were in total disarray before the season started and even into the season. You know, typically when a team wins a championship, they're building towards it for a few years, and it doesn't just sort of come out of nowhere. And maybe the 1960 Pirates might be the only other team that is even in the same neighborhood in terms of, you know, that wasn't expected and they weren't building towards that for years and years. But definitely a unique situation here.
Or the 1975 Pittsburgh Triangles.
That team definitely came out of nowhere. I was not counting them in the 16 World Championship. So, so let's talk about how we got here. So in the mid 2000s, the Penguins are a struggling franchise. They're really bad. There's not a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. But you know, the one of the things in sports when you're bad, they give you high draft picks, and you're supposed to be able to rebuild with those high draft picks. And with some good management and admittedly a little bit of luck, the Penguins were able to turn those high draft picks into this core of star players: Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang, and the goaltender Marc-Andre Fleury. And with that core and some secondary pieces, they're able to go from worst to first. They make the Stanley Cup Finals in 2008, and then they win the Stanley Cup in 2009. We did an episode about that Cup-winning team. Very exciting run to beat the Red Wings in 7 games. And when they win that first Cup, Crosby is 21 years old at that point. And none of those other guys that I mentioned are much older than that. And so at that point, the future is just so bright. You have this young, energetic coach, Dan Bylsma. You have this very smart general manager, Ray Shero, who had taken that core and put all these great supporting players like Jordan Staal and Bill Guerin and Sergei Gonchar. And you just thought, man, the sky's the limit. How many championships are we going to win? And it doesn't work out that way. The next few years are rough, primarily due to Crosby having the concussion injuries. And when he finally returns, they have just an absolutely disastrous playoff loss to the Flyers in 2012. So disastrous, in fact, that we did an entire episode on it that we titled Series from Hell. And the main takeaway, we talked about it in that episode, the main takeaway from that series is it kind of exposes the Penguins as, I think, petulant and undisciplined. They were a bunch of guys that were really talented, but they unraveled easily. And that label kind of carries into the following seasons, and the Penguins don't do much to shake that label. And Steve, I don't know, was that a fair label?
Well, then they got James Neal definitely fit that label. Like he always like anybody with a Flyers uniform on, he seemed to want to fight. And Malkin definitely, you know, he wasn't quite. I don't think he quite turned into like the best. He's probably the best all around defensive, offensive, like Russian player to ever play the game, and I don't think he had quite gotten there yet. So, I mean, it's just kind of was something under Bylsma. Like I guess maybe because they were stars, maybe didn't, you know, push them as hard or discipline them as hard as maybe he should have. So, I think that kind of played into it too. You know, you gotta have the respect of the players, and there does seem to be, like I've said this before, I think seems to be a shelf life to hockey coaches for whatever reason. So, I mean, there was a year in there too where like everybody got hurt, like Crosby got hurt and Malkin was hurt, and then they lost in the second round, I think, to Tampa Bay, but they still made the playoffs and made the second round, But they still Jordan Staal at that point. So, I mean, it definitely was, things were trending to where they were just kind of be one of those, like they won one, but they never really won another one.
Right.
And other teams were winning back-to-backs in between that, like the Kings and the Blackhawks,
Right. They were definitely being surpassed by those teams. In 2013, they make a bunch of deals at the trade deadline. They get Hall of Famer Jerome McGinley, among others. And they make a run to the conference finals, but there they get lambasted by Boston. That's the series where they only scored 2 goals all series. The other thing that happened during that 2013 run was Marc-Andre Fleury loses his starting job, and ultimately he ends up seeing a sports psychologist to kind of get his head right. So he's having some tough times around this time as well. 2014, they're in the second round of the playoffs and they have a 3-1 lead on the New York Rangers. But once again, they come unglued and they blow that series.
I remember that series. I remember thinking, like, even when they had a 3-1, that they had been kind of lucky. Like, they had gotten some lucky goals and stuff and just had kind of been scoring at the right times. And I kind of thought the Rangers were at least equal to them. And then I really wasn't, like, too shocked when the Rangers came back and won that.
Yeah, well, it wasn't like the Penguins were way better. I think it was more just that they had a 3-1 lead. All you had to do was win one of the last 3.
Yeah.
And they
couldn't do it, yeah.
And by the time it got to Game 7, I think the worst part about that was by the time it got to Game 7, like you knew they were gonna they were gonna lose. Like you just knew they were gonna lose, and because that's the way things went under Bylsma, and that was really the loss that did everything in. After that loss, the team owners Mario Lemieux and Ron Burkle and the team CEO David Morehouse, they get together and they decide, you know what? It's time to make a change in terms of the general manager and the head coach, and it was kind of hard to believe it had come to that point because 5 years earlier, they're hoisting the Stanley Cup. Shiro. I mean, remember that whole anytime Shiro would make a trade that all over social media would be like, "In Shiro we trust."
Yeah.
He was the smartest guy in hockey, and then Bylsma to this day is still the Penguins' all-time winningest coach, and at 5.5 seasons, their longest tenured coach in the 55-year history of the team or whatever.
5.5 years.
Yeah, he's the longest tenured coach, and one of the things the Penguins have never had is like stability. You look at the Steelers with 3 head coaches since 1969 and the same general manager for the last 2 decades. The Penguins have never even sniffed that level of stability. And you just thought that the Shiro Bylsma era was going to be that like long-term stability. Like this is going to be our team for a long time. And by 2014, like it's clear that that's not going to work anymore. And so it's kind of shocking that it got to that point. But I think everybody, fans and media and obviously ownership agreed that it needed to get there. They do make a curious decision. Though they fire Shiro, but then they just kind of like punt on Bylsma. Like they don't say he's fired. They say, well, Shiro is fired and the next GM can name his own head coach. And people are like, so does that mean it's not Bylsma? And they're like, well, the next GM can name his own head coach. And it's like, what?
So I guess they left it open to keeping Bylsma. But I remember I always just thought Bylsma was gone. It was just a matter of time.
I think everybody knew that, but they didn't officially say that. And Steve, I don't know. It reminds me of like the scene in Office Space where they lay off the one guy, but they don't tell him he's fired. They just quit giving him a paycheck.
Yeah, they just figure it would work its way out naturally.
Yeah, because they don't like confrontation.
So you told him he was fired. No, we just fixed the glitch.
Yeah, we just fixed the glitch. It'll work its way out naturally. That's honestly what it reminded me of. And it's like Cleveland Brown-esque, like way to run your organization. That was very bewildering that's what they chose to do. So, okay, so now who's going to be the new GM? And there was a list of candidates. I think probably at the top of that list was Jason Botterill, who
Just got fired by Buffalo.
Yeah, who just recently lost his job as the Buffalo GM, but back then he was the assistant Penguins GM, and his big claim to fame was he was the cap guy for the Penguins, and that was a big deal because remember the cap had only started in 2005, so teams were still figuring out how to use it, and he did a really good job figuring out how you kept that core of star players, how you put guys around them, how you still manage the cap. So he was a young, sort of up and coming, name, and he was right in the Penguins front office already. Tom Fitzgerald, who was also in the Penguins front office, was another candidate. Most fans remember Tom Fitzgerald when he played for the Florida Panthers and scored the game-winning goal in Game 7 of the '96 Conference Finals. So that was kind of odd. It would have been like hiring Francisco Cabrera to be the Pirates manager. But he was a strong candidate. Pierre Maguire. Remember that? He was a candidate.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Pierre Maguire, most people know from NBC, he's the guy that sits between the benches and gives the sort of on-ice commentary for the NBC games. But he had a history with the Penguins. He was an assistant on that 91 and 92 Cup
Yeah, he
teams.
was, yeah.
He was close with Mario.
I think he had hair back then.
I think he did, yeah. And then the Tampa Bay and Nashville assistant GMs were also candidates. And so kind of the thinking was, they're probably going to go with, so when you talk about like the assistant GMs on Tampa Bay and Nashville, those were teams that were doing well. And, you were thinking they were going to go with like the next guy, the next, star GM, the young guy that hasn't got his chance yet. Instead, they hired a guy named Jim Rutherford. And that's another curious decision. So I think we all know what Jim Rutherford is now, but let's talk about what
I remember I didn't
was.
think much of him when they hired. I thought, okay, really? Yeah.
Well, and that's what a lot of people thought.
Yeah.
I mean, and honestly, yeah, it was not a popular decision. I mean, so let's talk about Jim Rutherford. So the good on Jim Rutherford's resume, he had spent 20 years as the general manager and the team president of the Carolina Hurricanes. That dated all the way back to when they were still the Hartford Whalers. And that was a franchise that was kind of a nothing franchise. And when he was the GM, they won a Stanley Cup in 2006. So that was a big deal, winning a Stanley Cup with a franchise like the Carolina Hurricanes. He also had a history with the Penguins. He was their starting goaltender in the early 70s. So he had played here. So that was the good. The bad, I want to be careful how I say this. But he came across as like super, super old. And he wasn't. He was only 65. But he was like one of those guys that like it was 65 but like looks and talks like he's 85.
Well, he is a little on the crotchety side.
He kind of talks like these young people today. Like he didn't say that, but that was kind of how he sounded.
Well, my favorite like Jim Rutherford story is there's a guy. I don't know if he works for the Trib anymore. Rob Rossi, does he? I don't. He might
I
work
remember
for
Rob Rossi.
I think he works for DK Sports, or he doesn't work for the Trib anymore. I don't think.
Oh, he got into an argument with him in an elevator.
Yes, and Rob Rossi's family owns the Dairy Queen on Banksville Road. Okay, and Jim Rutherford's like, "Why don't you go back to serving ice cream?" Because I actually only know that because I saw like Rob Rossi in there one time. I was like, "Oh, there's Rob Rossi," and he literally was serving ice. So maybe listen to Jim like, "Oh, I better go back and if he want a blizzard."
So it was like, and again, you thought
it kind of goes into the crotchety old man. That's like such a crotchety old man thing to say. Yeah.
And again, you kind of expected them to go with like the up and coming analytics genius assistant GM that's going to finally get his chance and make his big name on the Penguins and their stars, and they go with sort of an old retread. And the other thing, so he had won the Stanley Cup in Carolina, but they hadn't made the playoffs. This is 2014. They hadn't made the playoffs since 2009 when they had gotten swept out of the conference finals by Pittsburgh. And during that time, he had been criticized a lot in Carolina for mismanaging their cap. So again, does this guy really know what he's doing? And so they have an introductory press conference, which by all accounts is just a total disaster. Because he gets up there at the podium, and the first thing he says is he's only going to be there like 2 or 3 years. And like, what? Like he's only going to be like, he's like, yeah, I'm only going to do this job for 2 or 3 years.
Well, he is 65.
Well, but why would you? So when do you ever hire somebody? GMs usually talk about 5-year plans in the future, and he's
He has a 1-year plan.
He's talking about retiring.
1-year plan was file for Social Security, I guess.
At his introductory, at his introductory press conference, he's talking about retiring and filing for Social Security and going to the old folks' home and you know the presumably the idea was he was going to, you know, they were going to keep Botterill on as the assistant, and that Botterill would eventually replace him, or maybe Fitzgerald, or maybe Bill Guerin, who was also in the front office. But again, so you're hiring a guy just temporarily, and then the other thing he says is that, you know, Bylsma is indeed fired, but that he didn't even meet with Bylsma. He just went based off information that was given to him.
So he didn't even like call him or anything, like, hey.
Apparently not.
He just like Bowser like picked up the phone. Hey, I'm fired.
Yeah.
Like,
so that whole thing about
yeah.
the GM picks his own coach was apparently nonsense. I thought that was so that was, yeah. I mean, for Bylsma needed to go. I think we can all agree on that. It was his time. His time was up. But he gave a lot of good years to the franchise, and I just thought that was a crummy way to treat him on his way out, the way that they handled that. And that was just unlike Mario. It was unlike the Penguins. It's not how they usually do business. So that was discouraging. And then to have Jim Rutherford stand up there and be like, hey, I'm only going to be here for 2 years. It didn't inspire a lot of confidence. So he's the GM. Nobody's excited about that. Now they have to hire a head coach. They hire a guy named Mike Johnston.
This was always an odd hire. I know. Yeah.
Yeah. So Mike Johnston, what was his previous job, Steve?
He was a coach of a junior hockey team in Portland.
Yeah.
But he had won, like, what is it, Calder Cups? Or he had won Calder Cups with them. But
great.
But like what I had heard was like that, like, I think they were like, I don't know if they were Vancouver or Chicago. Like, they would just like send all like their players down, like players that were so like he would basically fill like almost an NHL team at the end of the season because. So, I mean, I don't know how good he really was at developing young talent, but it was definitely an odd choice. Like,
yeah, to put a junior hockey coach in charge of Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin, and especially in charge of a situation where they needed to reshape the culture of the franchise.
Yeah, for whatever reason, he didn't seem like that. I don't know. I don't know what they were. I mean, they must have saw something in him.
I guess. I mean, and the other thing that we have to say about Mike Johnston, again, I'm not young anymore, so I'm not criticizing anybody's age, but he was 57 years old, and the only reason I bring that up is because I could see if they hired a junior hockey coach that was like 31, you know, and like, oh yeah, well he's a junior hockey coach because he's like up and coming through the ranks, so kind of like Sean McVay or like for the Rams, like a coach like that. I could see that kind of hire, but Mike Johnston was 57. He was not up and coming. He was a junior hockey coach who they just decided to bring to the NHL, and he didn't inspire a lot of confidence either. I mean, he just looked like office worker number 4 from Central Casting, you know. And then the other thing that they did was they hired Rick Tocchet as an assistant coach, and apparently it was sort of a package deal. The other guy that they were trying to get, or that there was rumors of them getting, was the guy that went to Vancouver, and supposedly maybe the reason he didn't want to come to Pittsburgh was because they were going to make him pair with Tocchet. Nobody knows if that's true or not, but Rick Tocchet, of course, had been on the Penguins '92 Cup team, had a lot of history in Pittsburgh, was an NHL head coach. But he had been out of the league for 5 years. He was announcing with Philadelphia, I think. So he had been out of the league for a while, too. And, I again, like you said, Steve, it was an odd hire.
I think Rick Tocchet ended up being, you know, not to foreshadow, but Rick Tocchet ended up being the right person for that assistant job, though. They at least got the assistant coach right.
They got that right, and that ends up being key to the run we're going to talk about because he stays on. But Mike Johnston, I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe they were thinking, as a junior hockey coach, he could like mold the young guys, and Tocchet would kind of add that grit that they were missing. I don't know, but
well, he just seemed very generic. Like I don't know what they were thinking. I like he wasn't like you said like it wasn't like a Therrien where he's gonna like Therrien was older, but Therrien would, you know, cuss you out in bilingual. You know, I mean, this guy just didn't seem to like he seemed to like. kind of be maybe a little too even keeled. Maybe this team needed somebody with a little bit more like force, like leadership, than this guy was offering. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, so they have this generic junior hockey coach and this, retread kind of older sounding GM. And I think both of those hires were widely panned by the media, by fans. I don't know anybody that was like, yeah, this is what's going to turn everything around. And when they go into the 2015 season, it doesn't go well. At the end of the season, the Penguins, they're kind of in that like bottom tier playoff grouping, and they had 6 games left at the end of the season. They only needed to win one of those to clinch a playoff spot, and they lose the first 5 of those last 6. So now they come down to the final game of the season to clinch the playoff spot against the worst team in the league, Buffalo. They do win that to get into the playoffs, but then they get obliterated in the first round by the Rangers. That series isn't very long, and it ends on an overtime goal by a guy named Carl Hagelin, who we'll talk about later. And to be fair to that 2015 team, they had a lot of injuries that year, so that didn't help. But Rutherford kind of made things worse. He messed up the cap situation, and they ended up having to play with 5 defensemen for a while at the end of the season.
Yeah.
Because they weren't allowed to call anybody up because they had like used their allotment of the cap or whatever.
Jeez.
So that was pretty bad. And then the midseason trade he traded a first-round pick to the Edmonton Oilers for David Perron, who was a total bust as a Penguin. So that was a waste of a first-round pick for David Perron. So now we're heading into the 2015-16 season, and there's really not a lot of optimism in Pittsburgh. The Stars aren't living up to their expectations. The new coach and the new GM both look like busts, and they're not giving really anybody to play alongside those star players. But Rutherford does start making some deals that end up paying off later. The first deal he makes is actually back at the 2014 draft when he trades James Neal to the Predators for Patrick Hornquist. And that was deemed risky at the time because Neal was a 6-time 20 goal scorer. He was one of their best goal scorers, and he was still in the prime of his career. But Steve, you already mentioned he was kind of the poster child of that.
Yeah, he's a goal scorer, not a fighter. And like fighting by that time in the league was kind of like, this isn't the old NHL where you could really drop your gloves and, prove a point. I mean, fighting if it's not completely gone now, it was definitely on its way out even back then. So.
And I don't know that Neal was a guy that used fighting as like a strategy, like some.
No, he would just take a penalty almost.
He would just get mad.
Yeah.
I don't know if there was a strategy to it. So he was kind of one of the poster children of that whole petulant, underproducing culture. And Hornquist was the exact opposite. Hornquist is a guy that will stand in front of the net and grit things out. So that was a risky trade. Ends up being big though, and again part of changing the culture. He also trades Brandon Suter for Nick Bonino. So the Penguins, when they won the 2009 Cup, they modeled it on this 3-center idea where you had 3 strong lines centered by, at the time it was Crosby, Malkin, and Jordan Staal. Well, in 2012, Jordan Staal wants out. He wants to play with his brother in Carolina, and they had to trade him, and they trade him to Carolina, where Rutherford was at the time, for Brandon Suter. And Brandon Suter is supposed to be the guy that replaces Jordan Staal, and Brandon Suter was never Jordan Staal. He never even came close.
He was okay. He was like mediocre.
He was mediocre for sure, but they never had three.
Staal was more of a defensive center, and he could put the puck in the net occasionally, but I always thought he was more of a defensive center.
Yeah. Well, they had, again, the idea was that you can't possibly match up all your guys with 3 lines.
Yeah.
You could with maybe 1 or 2 lines, but 3 lines you're just going to be hosed. And they never had that with Suter. So they get Nick Bonino to be their new 3rd-line center. They also signed Matt Cullen. Cullen had won a cup with Rutherford in Carolina. He was almost 40 years old, if not 40 years old by this time. So he thought he was actually going to retire because he didn't think anybody else would want to pick him up. Rutherford calls him, and he ends up being a key character guy. We talked about him in our B team episode. how important he was to the team. And then the big deal that was made in the summer of 2015 was that Rutherford traded a handful of guys and draft picks to Toronto for Phil Kessel. And so, Steve, how would you describe Phil Kessel?
Enigmatic. Is that a good, like, puzzling? Like, he can, maybe not. I mean, Phil is what he is. You know what you're getting with Phil Kessel, probably. He plays a certain way, in like getting him to play like not turn the puck over like right at the blue line sometimes, and just do what he's good at, which is shoot the puck. He always was a good goal scorer, but he wasn't, and probably in Toronto, like maybe it was just too much, and he doesn't have the personality to be like the face of the franchise, and that's probably what they wanted in Toronto.
Yes.
So he's probably like another great, like, in here he wasn't the face of the franchise. All he had to be was, Sidney Crosby or Malkin's wing, So,
right.
I mean, it was probably a much better fit and role for him here than it was in Toronto, and the pressure was definitely going to be not on him. So, and he was another one that had a tendency to pout a little. But I guess, as we'll discuss later, like, he kind of gets whipped into shape. So
he does, and you're right. Toronto was a tough market. I mean, that's the center of the hockey world in Canada.
It's probably equivalent to like playing in New York or LA.
Yes.
I would say.
Yes, that's a good comparison.
Yeah.
And he got into fights with reporters. I mean, it was ugly. He had just fallen out of favor, and Toronto was looking to trade him and kind of start over. And the Penguins took a chance there, and ends up working out. And Phil, I mean, misunderstood. A lot of his teammates, when I went back and watched some of the interviews, they kept using the word misunderstood. He just wasn't. He would kind of come across as surly and standoffish, but maybe he just didn't like talking to the media. I mean, it's hard with guys like that. So Phil Kessel's on board as well. And so when the 2015-16 regular season begins, there's some new faces, but sort of the same mediocre level of play. The Stars are still inconsistent. So Mike Johnston hasn't really changed anything there. Sidney Crosby especially is not scoring goals. By mid-November, he has 0 even strength goals, and he's a -7. And I went back and dug up a Facebook post that I put out there around this time, and I openly talked about, like, hey, I love Sid, but is it time to trade him? Because it's just not working out. He's not going to be the same player anymore. Maybe he needs a fresh start somewhere else. It's embarrassing to look back at now, but at the time, it just felt like maybe it's time to break up the band. Like, this isn't working anymore. I mean, the idea with bringing in a new coach and GM was to rebuild around that core of Crosby, Malkin, Fleury, Letang, but maybe the problem was with the core itself. Who knows? But that's what I was thinking. And again, Crosby was having a miserable season, and he just wasn't producing at all. On December 8th, things get worse. Pascal Dupuis, who had been in and out of the lineup with these lingering health problems related to a blood clot, he's told by doctors that basically his health is at serious risk if he continues to play hockey, and he's forced to retire very abruptly mid-December of the season. So that was a big blow. Pascal Dupuis had a really productive career here in Pittsburgh. Remember, he was the throw-in guy on the Hossa trade. It was like Hossa and Dupuis for all the stuff we gave the Thrashers. And he ends up being, especially for Crosby, on Crosby's wing, he ends up being such a key player for years. So, and he was beloved by not only the fans, but by his teammates. So that was devastating. I went back and found an interview with Crosby the day that Dupuis announced his retirement, and Crosby's always so vanilla and composed in interviews, and he was almost in tears. So that was really tough. And then December 12th, the team's 15-10-3. Again, inconsistent, up and down, no real prospects for the future. And so the organization decides, We've had enough of Mike Johnston. And they replace him with the head coach in Wilkes-Barre, the AHL team, Mike Sullivan. So now they've got a new head coach in the middle of the season. And Mike Sullivan, there's two things I want to talk about with Mike Sullivan. Number one, he was and still is, he's a really good schemer. The Penguins have been playing this 1-3-1 counterattack under Johnston. Crosby, again, we mentioned his productivity was almost nothing, and Malkin basically just ignored it. I mean, he just was like, I'm going to do what I want to do. So that wasn't working. Sullivan decided to focus the team around speed, and that was really pioneering because, Steve, you mentioned the LA Kings before. This is the era where the Los Angeles Kings, they had won 2 Stanley Cups, and their style of play was, we're going to suffocate the opponents with defense and raw strength. And that was the trend. Teams were trying to copy that trend. And Sullivan decides to go totally against that grain and focus on speed. We're just going to be faster than you. And he really wanted to establish an identity. He felt like the Penguins had no identity, and he was right.
Yeah, they really didn't. Yeah.
And it was interesting. I don't know that I ever heard another head coach say this, but what Sullivan said was, you know, there's 29 other teams in the league, and I want every team, when they play the Penguins, they should be game planning the same way. So if the Penguins are playing the Rangers on a Monday, then they should be saying, okay, here's who the Penguins are, here's how we can beat them. And then if they're playing the Devils on a Wednesday, the Devils should be coming up with a similar game plan, knowing this is who the Penguins are, this is how we beat them. And I thought that was interesting because, again, I don't know that I ever heard a coach in a sport say that, but he said we should have an identity. Every team should know who we are and how they're going to game plan against us. So I thought that was interesting. Matt Cullen, who, as we mentioned, had been around the block a few times, called Sullivan the best X's and O's coach he'd ever been around. So that was high praise. Scotty Bowman even weighed in and said that he thought Sullivan had a high hockey IQ. So in terms of just being a guy that knew his X's and O's, Sullivan was really good. But then he was also a good leader. He had a very commanding voice and presence, almost drill sergeant-esque without the drill sergeant kind of yell. But he has that thick New England accent, and he's very like take charge. And his mantra was just play. That was his mantra. He thought the Penguins, needed to be more resilient, which everybody agreed with that. And just play. You can't control things that are out of your control. So just play, keep playing. And I think one of the things that really exemplified that, there was an incident with Malkin that first year where Malkin is chirping at the referees, and the cameras catch all this happening on the TV broadcast. Malkin's chirping at the referees, and Sullivan gets right in front of him and right in Malkin's face and says, "Hey, shut the bleep up." And Malkin does. And you would have never seen Bylsma do that, right? I mean,
no. That definitely showed a different type of person that he was. Like, I think that's probably what the Stars needed at that point in their career, is somebody like, kind of to tell them what's up. And then, I mean, it kind of gets reinforced when they start having success and, people start to buy in. So
it's funny how that changes too, because when we did our 2009 Penguins episode, we talked about how Therrien was that disciplinarian and the team was so exhausted by that, and they needed like somebody to loosen it up a little bit and let them have fun.
Now they needed somebody to go the other way.
They needed somebody to go the other way, yeah. And I think Sullivan probably did a better job than that than Therrien. Therrien just kind of treated you like you were, like he was the teacher and you were the kindergartner, I think. Yeah. And I think Sullivan had more respect than that, but he was still tough. So yeah, I agree with you, Steve. I think that's exactly what the team needed at that point. And like you said, the results, the team starts to flourish. Malkin and Letang both make the All-Star game. And Crosby, who was having that miserable season, from December 12th, which is the day Sullivan gets hired, through the end of the season, Crosby outscores the rest of the NHL, and he's named a finalist for the Hart Trophy. So that's pretty amazing turnaround for a guy that was -7 at one point. Fleury also has a really great second half of the season. he posts an impressive 35 wins in 58 games played. So that's a lot of winning for Marc-Andre Fleury. And Sullivan also gets a lot out of his Wilkes-Barre players. He ends up calling up several of his Wilkes-Barre players during the year, and they all make positive contributions, especially, I think, two guys, Brian Rust and Connor Sherry, especially stuck out. Scotty Wilson was in there too, and some other guys, but definitely those two guys made big contributions. So the Penguins are starting to win a lot of games, and meanwhile Rutherford is still wheeling and dealing. So there's a couple of deals he makes during the year. December 14th, he trades Rob Scuderi to Chicago for Trevor Daley. Rob Scuderi, we talked about him in both that 2009 episode and our B team episode. Scuderi was a really important cog in that 2009 team, and he was a really good player for the Penguins for a lot of years. At this point, he's on his second stint with the Penguins, and he's a little over the hill, and he's slow. I mean, that's the big thing. Rob Scuderi was not fast, and he doesn't fit in with this new style that the Penguins want to play with speed. Trevor Daley had kind of fallen out of favor in Chicago, and so they trade Scuderi for Trevor Daley. That ends up being a massive, massive steal because Daley becomes a really important player in this run. And then on February 27th, another steal. They send a third-round pick to the Oilers for Justin Schultz. And Schultz and Daley both end up becoming top four defensemen. And to get them for an over-the-hill Scuderi and a third-round pick, that was pretty amazing. January 16th, they finally give up on David Perron. They send him and Adam Clendenning to the Ducks for Carl Hagelin. And that, at the time, doesn't seem like the greatest trade because you had to give up a first-round pick for Perron, so you're really turning around a first-round pick for Carl Hagelin. And Carl Hagelin was a good player, but no one would ever trade a first-round pick for Carl Hagelin.
Well, Carl Hagelin's fast, but he doesn't have like the greatest hands.
But that was it. You hit the nail on the head there. He was fast.
Yeah.
And so sometimes Carl Hagelin's not worth a first-round pick if you put him on 29 other teams.
Yeah.
But with the style the Penguins wanted to play, that's the guy that they wanted, and he ends up, of course, pairing on that third line with Bonino and Kessel, and that sort of becomes a phenomenon. That's the HBK line.
Well, you remember they didn't even want to do it, the HBK line. It just kind of happened by accident because Malkin got hurt at the end of the season. They weren't even going to put those guys together, and it was kind of like out of desperation. Sullivan finally did it, and boy, once it clicked for whatever reason.
Yeah, it became like a cultural phenomenon. I want to say, like it really was. I mean, everybody, the HBK line was just a big thing.
They had a sandwich of Permanis, the HBK sandwich. Yeah, I think it was ham, bacon, and kibasi. Yeah,
yeah.
It was all pork. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think I don't know who gets credit for naming them the HBK line. I think it might have been Mark Madden, and I think that was a reference. That was a wrestling reference.
The Heartbreak Kid, or
it was Shawn Michaels wrestling reference. But regardless, that became a big deal. They were invited to like Stephen Colbert show and stuff like that. It was a big deal, and it wasn't just because of no reason. They really gelled together, and so now the Penguins have that third line that they've been trying to re-put together for so many years, and now they have it. The reason I mentioned when I listed those trades, the reason I mentioned the dates is because all three of those trades were well before the trade deadline. So and that was something that Rutherford has been known for his entire time here in Pittsburgh. He makes these deals during the season before the trade deadline, and very important deals. And he's not waiting till that last day and trying to get rental players and trying to compete with all these other teams. He's kind of identifying these deals before that. So I think that was important. The Penguins end up winning 14 of their final 16 games. They end up finishing with 104 points. That's good for second place in the Metropolitan Division. And so they head into the playoffs with a lot of steam. I mean, this season, which appeared to be, mediocre, and the franchise is in chaos, and maybe this is it for this whole Rutherford experiment. Now, all of a sudden, they're roaring into the playoffs as one of the hottest teams in the league. And in the first round, they're playing the New York Rangers, who had eliminated them each of the previous 2 seasons. So that was a big deal to play the Rangers in the first round because now you have a chance to kind of exercise the demons, right, in the first round. And heading into that series, so Fleury, we mentioned he had a really good second half of the season, but he had suffered a concussion near the end of the regular season. And when he was hurt, they brought up this 21-year-old kid named Matt Murray, very scrawny 21-year-old kid, and he plays really well. He goes 9-2-1 in the regular season. And so now you're heading into the playoffs. Fleury's still hurt, and Matt Murray's going to be your goaltender in the playoffs, which, I mean, he was hot, but he never played in the playoffs before. He's 21 years old. Like, how good is he going to do? You know, that was a concern. And then, to make matters worse, in the final regular season game,
I remember he got hurt.
Yeah.
They ran into it. Somebody ran into him.
It was Braden Shen.
Yeah.
Because, you know.
Yeah, was it the Flyers? Yeah. They hit him right in the head.
Yeah, because, well, when you're scumbags, you're going to do scumbag thing. And so Braden Shen ran into him. So now Murray's hurt for the playoffs, and they have to start their third goaltender, Jeff Zatkoff, starts the playoffs. And he actually does a pretty good job holding down the fort. He wins game 1. They lose game 2.
That game 1 was unbelievable that they won that because especially with your third goalie, like you could tell they were just kind of hanging on like for him. And like game 2, he kind of like you could tell, okay, this guy, you know, is a third goalie for a reason. Yeah. But like if you and that was in New York, wasn't it? Or was it?
It was in Pittsburgh.
Oh, it was here. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's still not good losing a game at home, but still, I think with all the injuries, and it goes back to the just play with Sullivan, like under Baalsma, they would have probably, or Johnson, folded up the tent.
Yes.
It would have been swept in 4, you know? Whereas now it's like, you know, they at least split the first 2. And
yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
That was just one of many points of adversity they would face. And they overcame that. And Murray comes back. And after that, the Penguins just kind of overwhelmed the Rangers. They win the next 3. It's a short series. And I think one of the games at Madison Square Garden, they even had to pull Henrik Lundqvist out of the net because they were just peppering him with goals. So that was great. That was a great way to open the playoffs, kind of steamrolling over the Rangers, getting that
especially
revenge.
Lundqvist, I call him an ice sitter. We just shoot the puck high on that guy. It's like, come on.
And the Rangers were really good during that era too. I mean, they had a couple of really good years there. They were in the Stanley Cup Finals.
That was with St. Louis.
Yeah. They had some good teams, but the Penguins definitely were better that year. So that's the first round. But the second round is where you know now we're wearing our big boy pants because the second round is against Washington, and the Capitals had won the President's Trophy that year, and they were just by far the best team in the league all year. I mean, I don't think anyone at the end of the regular season would have argued that. They were just the best team in the league all year. And they kind of had a similar road to get there that the Penguins had because, you know, Crosby and Ovechkin had both come into the league at the same time. And the Capitals, like the Penguins, had built this team around Ovechkin. And that team just never won anything. And they kind of dismantled that, and they kind of had to rebuild around Ovechkin the same way the Penguins are trying to rebuild around Crosby and Malkin. And they did a pretty good job. They that offseason, they signed T.J. Oshie from the Blues. T.J. Oshie was just a consummate winner. I've always been an Oshie fan ever since the Olympics, where he scored all the shootout goals against the Russians.
Just kept sending them out there, yeah.
Yeah, I've always been a big T.J. Oshie fan. And Justin Williams had won several Stanley Cups. He was Mr. Game 7. He's the guy that always won Game 7s. They had a young emerging star, Evgeny Kuznetsov, who obviously is a huge star now. So they really had rebuilt very well around Ovechkin, who was obviously still very good himself. So they were a really good team. There was, of course, a very long history between these two clubs. They had played each other a ton in the 90s and 2000s. Plus, that Crosby-Ovechkin rivalry was to hockey kind of like Larry Bird, Magic Johnson was to the NBA back in the day. So, this is going to be a tough haul playing this team. And game 1 goes into overtime, and Oshie scores in overtime to win game 1. So the Capitals go up right away 1-0. Game 2, Brooks Orpik, of course, played for the Penguins for years. He's one of the Penguins' all-time leaders in games played. But at this point, he's playing for the Capitals. And in game 2, he hits Olli Mata late. Brooks Orpik was not a guy that played dirty. Brooks Orpik had a lot of big hits in his time in Pittsburgh. He was not a guy that ever really played dirty, but that was a dirty hit. And he ends up getting suspended for 3 games in the middle of that series, which ends up being
That's unheard
important.
of in the NHL too. Yeah.
It is unheard of because they never blow the whistle in the playoffs. They never discipline anybody, and that hit was bad enough where they actually suspended Brooks for 3 games. But the Penguins, again, this is another situation where they might have collapsed in the past, or tried to get retribution on the ice by cross-checking somebody or whatever.
Yeah. We're gonna hit TJ Oshie to avenge Olli Mata.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's what they might have done in the past. But again, to your point about this play, they get their retribution on the scoreboard. They win 2-1. The loss of Orpik ends up really hurting the Capitals. He was a very important defenseman for them. The Penguins win Game 3. Game 4, Letang is suspended. He got a 1-game suspension for a hit in Game 3. I thought that was a little bit. It was a suspendable hit, but I thought it was a little bit of like, well, we suspended their defenseman, so we have to suspend yours. So Letang's out for Game 4, but Trevor Daley does a really good job covering for the absence of Letang, and Hornquist wins Game 4 in overtime. So now, all of a sudden, the Penguins are up 3-1. And Game 5 is in Washington. The Capitals do win Game 5 to stave off elimination. And the series comes back to Pittsburgh for Game 6. And this is where, if you're the Penguins, you obviously want to win it in Pittsburgh in Game 6. You don't want to have to go back to Washington for Game 7. This is your chance to win it. And they roar out to a 3-0 lead. The HBK line was really big in this game. All 3 of those goals were by Hagelin and Kessel. And the Capitals do get a couple of goals to make it 3-2. And now we're in the 3rd period, and the Penguins are just trying to hold on to that 3-2 lead. Like, let's just hold on to the 3-2 lead and wrap up this series. And then something really, really bizarre happens in that 3rd period. And so when they came back from the lockout in 2005, they had a bunch of new rules. And Steve, you talked about some of those in our previous episodes about how they got rid of the red line. They were trying to increase scoring. The automatic icing, the trapezoid around the goaltender, all that stuff. One of the other rules that they implemented was that if you were in your own end and you shot the puck into the crowd,
Yeah, you couldn't. Yeah, that was a penalty.
that was an automatic penalty, whether you did it on purpose or not.
I remember one time Matt Cook tried to shoot at the other goal or clear it, and he shot it all the way over, like into the net, and it was a penalty.
Yeah,
And it,
yeah, and I don't think.
and that was like the length of the ice.
Yeah, and Matt Cook wasn't trying to shoot it into the crowd there, but some guys did.
Well,
and that was
in
the
the old
problem.
days, yeah, if you were in trouble, trapped in your own end, just put it in the stands,
Yes.
and you could make it. Not only you could make a change, like not only was you get a penalty, you couldn't make a change. I think they changed that rule too, where you couldn't change, like make a line change. So
Right.
So it was like really getting punished twice. So not only are your players tired, you're now down a man too.
And guys did do that on purpose. I remember the one incident I remember the most was Darius Kasparaitis in Game 7 against Buffalo in 2001. They were Buffalo was pressing, and Kasparaitis actually whacked it into the stands with his hand. Like he actually whacked the puck into the stands with his arm. And the Buffalo fans were so angry, and they wanted something to be done, but that wasn't a penalty back then.
Yeah.
So I totally understand the rule. It was kind of like, remember football, they used to have like I accidentally grabbed the face mask was only a 5-yard penalty.
Yeah.
But then they were like, you know what? It doesn't matter what your intent is. And so sometimes a face mask, or sometimes in football, you're pulling the guy's face mask to tackle him. Sometimes it's just like you brush it.
But they went to 15 yards.
But it didn't matter intent, right?
Yeah.
So that's the rule in hockey. And the Penguins get 3 delay of game penalties inside the span of 2 minutes. So they shoot the puck up into the crowd. It's a penalty. They're trying to kill that penalty. They shoot the puck up into the crowd again. And then it happens a 3rd time. You'll never, ever see that again, I don't think. I really don't. It was so bizarre and so unusual. And the Capitals have a 5-on-3 power play, which is pretty much an automatic goal. And they score and they tie the game and they send it into overtime. And this is another scenario where I feel like the old Penguins would have just like packed up their bags and went home. Because, man, You're on the cusp of winning this series, and that was just bad luck. Those guys were not shooting the puck into the crowd on purpose. You would never do that, especially once you were down a man and once you were down 2 men.
Yeah.
There's no way you're going to do that on purpose. But the puck just kind of floated up into the crowd 3 times. And so bad luck, but you know what? They went into the locker room. Sid actually gives a speech about, hey guys, forget what happened. Let's just score the next goal. Let's end this. They go into overtime. They're pressing a lot in overtime, and Bonino gets a rebound, puts it in the net, and they eliminate the almighty Capitals in 6 games. And it was so satisfying just to beat that team and to beat the team, because that was the Capitals' year. They were going to win the Cup that year. And to beat them in the second round was so satisfying. And I always remember Mike Lang's call at the end of that game after Bonino scores. He says, all the president's men couldn't put Humpty together again, referencing the president's trophy that they won. That, of course, meant nothing at that point because now they were eliminated. So that was great and so satisfying to beat the Capitals on the way to a cup, just like they had in 2009. But it wasn't over. The Eastern Conference Finals are against the Tampa Bay Lightning, who were the defending conference champions. They had been in the finals the year before. They had swept the season series against the Penguins too. So the Penguins had not beaten them all season. So they weren't the President Trophy winners, but they were no slouch.
Yeah.
The other problem with playing the Lightning was, so they were overwhelming everybody with their speed. That didn't overwhelm Tampa because they played a similar game. They were also very fast. And they were also very resilient. Steven Stamkos was their best player. He was hurt,
yeah.
and they had overcome that. And then in game 1 of the series against the Penguins, Ben Bishop, who was their starting goaltender, he also gets hurt. And they, too, have to turn to a 21-year-old kid, Andrei Vasilevsky, who, like Matt Murray, just starts playing lights out once they put him in. And he eventually becomes their longtime goaltender. So Tampa Bay is very similar to the Penguins, and they come out, they storm to a 3-1 victory in Game 1 at Pittsburgh. And Game 2 is kind of back and forth, and that goes into overtime. And at this point, that's a big overtime because if the Tampa Bay gets the goal there, then they just won the first 2 games in Pittsburgh. Fortunately, Crosby gets the game winner there, so that the Penguins go back to Florida with it being tied 1-1. That was interesting. Fun fact, up until that point, neither Mario Lemieux nor Sidney Crosby had ever scored a playoff overtime goal in their careers. And that's kind of funny how that works because...
Yeah, normally it's like the secondary players that see, or like somebody you don't expect. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, players that have scored overtime goals for the Penguins in the playoffs, Luc Robitaille, Darius Kasparaitis, Brooks Orpik scored an overtime goal.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that's the only time they beat the Islanders.
Yeah. That was actually a series-winning goal that Orpik scored. So it's just funny how that works out. But Crosby scored there. The Penguins go down to Florida. They win Game 3, but they lose Game 4. The other thing that happened in Game 4 was that they lost Trevor Daley. He broke his ankle. And so now he's out for the rest of the playoffs, which is, we talked about how important Daley was and how...
That was a big loss for them, yeah.
That was a real big loss. Were they going to be able to overcome that? It's also clear at this point, after 4 games of the series, that Matt Murray's starting to struggle. Maybe he's starting to come back to earth a little bit. And Fleury had been ready to come back for a while. They just weren't going to put him in because Murray was on fire. And so now they're heading into Game 5, and... it's tied 2-2, and they decide, okay, thanks, Matt Murray, thanks for everything, but it's time to go back to our franchise Stanley Cup winning goaltender now that we're in crunch time. So Fleury starts Game 5, and he plays okay, but certainly not great. And the Penguins lose Game 5 at home in overtime. So now they're facing elimination for the first time, heading back to Tampa for Game 6. And Sullivan makes a really, really gutsy decision. He decides to go back to Matt Murray for that elimination Game 6 on the road. I mean, I don't know, Steve. I thought that was...
It definitely was, I don't know, I mean, unorthodox. Like, most coaches probably will went the veteran, but it just shows like Sullivan isn't really married to one player or the other. He'll go with whoever he thinks can win, so... Yeah, it definitely, as we're going to see, works out well for them.
It does. But man, I wasn't
Well, I
sure
think
about
two
it.
teams hadn't figured out like Matt Murray's weakness is like I think in the next series San Jose starts to figure it out if I remember correctly. Like he kind of has a weak glove hand. Like he's very good at like he kind of like reminds me of like Lundqvist. Like he's good at because he's tall. He's good at like taking up the net and like if he can get down to like kind of his butterfly, like he stops a lot of stuff. But his glove hand is a little weak. So
Yeah. Yes. So game 6, the Lightning get the first goal, and that's big because they're playing at home. They've just won the last 2 games. They have all the momentum, and now they get the first goal. The crowd's going crazy, but the Penguins' video coach Andy Saucier, he sees that Tampa was offsides, and he relays down to the bench to Sullivan to tell him to challenge it. He's like, I think they were offsides. Challenge it. So Sullivan challenges it, and the goal gets reversed. And it's a seemingly like small moment, but it's important. It shifts the momentum, and it's one of those like what if moments. Like what if that goal counts? Would that have changed the outcome? Maybe, maybe not.
well, first goal in hockey is always kind of big. So
Well, especially again, they were playing at home and they just won 2 games. Like they were just that rock kept rolling downhill for them, and then it was like all of a sudden it was like whoa. So so that was important. The Penguins come back. They win Game 6, send the series back to Pittsburgh for Game 7. Game 7 in Pittsburgh, unlikely star is Brian Russ,
yeah.
Mr. Game 7. Yeah, he has 2 goals, the only 2 goals for the Penguins in that game. And the Penguins cling to a 2-1 lead for the entire third period. Steve, the thing I remember about that third period was it was one of those like prevent defense kind of situations where you're just hanging on for dear life the whole time. It was so nerve-wracking, with the conference on the line and just, come on, just please hold the lead, please hold the lead. And I remember Doc Emmerich at one point was like, he said something like, this is just great hockey. And I'm just like, no, it's not. It is not
Shut up,
great
Doc.
hockey.
Yeah.
Just score, make it 3-1 or 4-1 so I can just relax.
Well, I always thought 2-goal lead was the worst goal, like because you tend to relax. So with a 1 goal, maybe you don't relax.
Maybe,
much,
but
yeah.
you know that any shot-
mistake, it could be the luckiest bounce
Right.
ever. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They do hang on. It's a little shaky at the end. I forget, was it Bonino? Somebody had a chance to just like shoot the puck like into like the middle of the ice and just the clock would have ticked away, but he like shot it up the boards and went into the bench, and they had to do a face-off in the zone. So it was a little shaky at the end, but they hang on. They win the game. They win the series. And just like in 2009, Sid comes out and with the alternate captains, with Malkin and with Chris Kunitz, and they hoist the Prince of Wales trophy up in the air. So if you listen to our 2009 episode, in 2000 there was a long-standing tradition: you don't touch the Prince of Wales trophy because that's not the trophy you want to win, and so nobody would touch it. And in 2008, Sid didn't touch it, but in 2008 they lost to the Red Wings. So in 2009 he touched it, and then in 2016, of course, he's going to do the same thing. He's going to touch it again. So they lifted the Prince of Wales trophy up in the air on home ice, and they're in the Stanley Cup Finals. And the team that they play in the finals is the San Jose Sharks. San Jose had a long history of kind of unfulfilled expectations. They had a lot of strong regular seasons, a lot of talent.
Yeah, like
with-
the San Diego Chargers of hockey. Yeah.
That's a great comparison. It really is, because you're right. They had a lot of really good players. They had Patrick Marleau and Joe Thornton for years, and they just never really went that far in the playoffs. But this was their year. They overcame all that. They made it all the way to the finals. They won the Western Conference, and so was this going to be their year, right? And it ends up being a competitive series. It doesn't go the distance like the Tampa Bay series did, but it's a bunch of really close games. Game 1 is in Pittsburgh. That's tied with 2 minutes left when Bonino scores to win the game in the final 2 minutes. Game 2 goes into overtime. Game 2 was pretty impressive because it goes into overtime and they have a face-off in the Shark zone. And Crosby huddles everybody together, and he tells Sheary and Letang, he basically says, I'm going to win the face-off. I'm going to win it back to Letang, and Letang, you're going to pass it to Sheary, who's going to kind of move to the middle of the ice, which was not his normal position. And then he told Sheary he wanted him to shoot it from there. And that's exactly what happens. Like Crosby wins the faceoff, back to Letang, over to Sherry. Sherry beats Martin Jones and wins the game in overtime. So that was just classic, like best player in the world just dictating what was going to happen. So that was a big win. The Sharks did accuse Sid of cheating on that faceoff, but whatever. I mean, sure he cheats, sure.
It wasn't like it was the guy from the Kings who had to make a rule where you couldn't do it with you. He was just like grabbing people and like take his hand and bat it back or.
Yeah. I mean, it was Logan Couture who made that accusation, and he said that Sid like somehow timed it, somehow like knew how to time it. It didn't make a lot of sense, but whatever. Be a sore loser, fine. The series goes back to San Jose for Game 3. The Sharks win Game 3 in overtime, but the Penguins take Game 4. Murray was really good in that fourth game. By this point, he's come back. Fleury at this point, people are starting to wonder, okay, what happens to Fleury now? Because Murray was definitely the guy. And do you keep Murray? Do you go back to Fleury? But that was a conversation for way after the season. Right now, Murray's definitely the guy. And that sets up a dramatic scenario for Game 5 because the series comes back to Pittsburgh, and now the Penguins have a chance for the first time ever to win the Stanley Cup in Pittsburgh and to win a championship on Pittsburgh soil for the first time since Maz hit the home run in 1960. And I know, Steve, this is one of your favorite Pittsburgh moments.
Yeah, it was just everybody went nuts. It was probably like a little too much. Like like sometimes your teams do, like they get too pumped up, like win one for the home team in the city, and maybe they got a little bit too excited. But they were definitely ready to go. It wasn't like they weren't ready to go. The Sharks just responded well and ended up. I mean, what were the 4 goals in the first period?
Yeah, it was a lot of scoring early, and then the Sharks just kind of pulled away. Yeah, it was disappointing for sure because, man, it would have been so cool to win that on home ice. And I think that was like a Thursday, and it was a weekday. I remember that.
Yeah, it would have went all weekend for sure.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the city was just on fire.
I think there were
day.
20,000 people outside. There was many people outside as there was in the arena.
Yeah, and that had started sometime in the afternoon. I mean, that was, it was. I was downtown that day, and just the whole day was just Penguin mania. It was like it was just like a celebration. Maz is actually at the game. But it didn't go as planned. But the Penguins still have 2 more chances to win this thing. So they go back to San Jose for Game 6. And Martin Jones, the goaltender for the Sharks, he deserves a lot of credit.
He played a good series.
He played a really good series. And that Game 6, the first period of that game, he made some huge saves because that could have gotten away from San Jose really quick. It's tied 1-1 in the second period. Letang takes a shot from like the far side of the net, and it goes in. And so now the Penguins are up 2-1. And once again, kind of like that Tampa Bay series, they have a 2-1 lead heading into the third period, and they have to hold it for the third period. But this time, it's not as nail-biting. The Penguins really clamped down in the third period. And amazingly, the Sharks only get 2 shots on net that entire third period, which is hard to believe. So whatever prevent defense or whatever that they might have been playing in that other Game 7, that other scenario that we mentioned earlier, they do something different here, and the Sharks only get 2 shots on net.
I don't think the Sharks were like as offensively. They weren't set up the way Tampa Bay were. They were more like the Kings, like big and strong and beat you. Like I remember, like Mike Milbury describing it as trying to like swat flies with like a shotgun. It was just there's a bunch of little guys skating around. You couldn't get to them. So, and that was another fun things when they did win is like who's the NBC? It was Mike Milbury and Keith Jones. They picked against the Penguins every series. They were wrong 4 times in a row. Every time. You were wrong 4 times in a row, hockey geniuses. Which was just, especially Milbury, because he doesn't like the Penguins at all. But that was kind of a nice little side effect of all that.
Yeah, Melbury, of course, had the history with the Penguins losing to them in the early '90s when he was Boston's coach. So
Well, he threw sticks on the ice and stuff. And
Yeah, he
called
was-
like the Badger Bob was like the nicest guy ever. Called him the professor, like Dr. Charles, like Badger Bob. Like,
Melbury's a jerk. But
yeah.
that's definitely the case.
But it wasn't just him, it was Keith Jones. There was a lot of people, like every time the Penguins would go, oh, they're going to lose. They're going to lose to New York. Oh, they're going to lose to Washington. And I could see picking against them against Washington, but like Tampa Bay and like the Rangers, really? I mean,
Well, that speaks to, again, I think that speaks to everybody had seen so many years of them just, okay, they had a bunch of good players, but then they just couldn't handle the pressure or the ups and downs of a playoff series because people had watched the Penguins fold too many times in the past. And so maybe that played into it, but this was definitely a different Penguins team. I mean, I think they'd proven that up until this point, and now they're in the final minutes against the Sharks. They pull Jones out of the net. Hornquist gets the puck and shoots on the empty net. It goes in, and pandemonium erupts on the Penguins bench. Pandemonium definitely erupted where I was watching the game, and the Penguins win the Stanley Cup. And it's amazing to think where they were at the beginning of that season, even December of that season. You know, it was just this middling franchise. They had no direction. They had no identity. They seemed like they were badly mismanaged. They didn't have any kind of plan. They had a GM that said he was going to quit. They had a coach that inspired nobody. They had star players who seemed like they were done. To go from that to being the champions, it's an amazing, amazing turnaround, and it's such a memorable season. They bring the Stanley Cup out, and there's some cool moments in there. I think the first guy that Crosby handed the cup to was Trevor Daley, who of course had broken his ankle, and then they gave it to Pascal Dupuis too. That was a big moment. He got to hoist the cup and be part of that team. He was around the team all year, even though he had retired. Had to retire in the middle of the season. So that was cool. And then, of course, it was cool to see Mario hoist the cup because he had been through so much. That was his fourth cup. And, you know, for all the questioning of the hires and the changes that were made, he ended up being smarter than the rest of us. And he did, you know, because he knew what they were doing. And
well, I wonder if
it worked.
Sullivan provided the direction, and once Rutherford could see the direction he was going in, he kind of like was able to jump on board and find the players for Sullivan that, you know, it does take some teamwork, but like maybe Johnston just didn't have the right direction that team needed. You know?
Yeah, that's a good point. I
And
mean,
once there was a direction and more of a clear plan that was working, you know, Rutherford found found Hagelin and some other players that fit in more with the system, you know, they wanted to play.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I mean, but of course it was Rutherford that hired Sullivan to begin with or promoted him. So, yeah, it's. I think they definitely worked well as a team for sure. So yeah, the Penguins win the cup. They have a parade. It's a big celebration, and it's another championship in Pittsburgh. You know, the aftermath of all this, the Penguins come back and repeat the following season. The big storyline through that season, we'll probably cover that in a separate episode. But again, the big storyline was what do you do at goaltender?
Yeah.
You know, and they end up making the controversial.
And no one had repeated since 98, 99, or 99, since the Red Wings.
Since the Red Wings in
Since
90, yeah, it was 97, 98.
Yeah.
And that was the pre-cap era. So nobody had
Yeah.
repeated in the cap era
Yeah.
because it was a lot harder to do. You couldn't keep all your players together. And the Penguins made the controversial decision that next season to keep both goaltenders. Matt Murray was basically designated the starter, and everybody thought, oh, they'll trade Fleury at the trade deadline.
No, they ended up keeping him.
Yeah, they ended up keeping him, and that ends up being very key.
And it cemented all their lead, the Crosby, Malkin, and Fleury even too, like because Fleury did win a lot of games during the regular season. So
Yes. Yep. No, it's pretty amazing. They repeat. Rutherford ends up staying beyond 2 years.
Yeah. I guess when you win a cup, yeah, it gives you a couple more years.
Yeah. So
And Rob Rossi's still working at Dairy Queen. Yeah.
and
he hoists the Blizzard every year.
and Sullivan at the time of this recording, at least, is still the head coach, and you know, still doing a pretty good job. I think the biggest thing for this cup was it really cemented Crosby's legacy and Malkin's legacy in Pittsburgh, because before that, it was that they had won that one Stanley Cup when Crosby was 21 years old, and then the rest of his career was going to be, letdowns and disappointments and, yelling at refs and batting the glove away from a Flyers player, that kind of stuff. That was kind of where his legacy was trending, and then now we're at the point where he's won 3 cups, and he's still 32. So
same thing with Malkin too. It's a shame Malkin doesn't seem to get a lot of respect. Like, he was left off one of those lists they make. Like, did the NHL have like a 100-year anniversary, and they left him off the list, which doesn't make any sense, because he has to be one of, like, he definitely is. He's just a different player from Ovechkin because he's a center, not a wing. And Ovechkin's definitely a pure goal scorer. But I mean, if you want to win a championship, you need Malkin on your team. I mean, if the Russians want to have any chance of winning an Olympic gold medal, they better put Malkin there. I mean, how in God's name they haven't won a gold medal with all that talent, I still can't figure out. But
yeah,
I mean,
they
haven't even medaled, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. But regardless of what the national media or whatever thinks about Malkin, I think his legacy is cemented here. That's that to get that second cup and then to get a third one, of course, a year later. If they don't win again for the rest of their careers, I think that's a pretty strong legacy. Three championships. How many other Pittsburgh athletes outside of the Super Steelers in the '70s have that on their resume?
I guess it would be the only one, because Ben only has 2.
Yeah.
Troy only has 2.
Willie Stargell and those guys only had 2.
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah. And Mario Lemieux, when
only
he
has
played,
2,
only had 2 as a player. So, again, really cemented their legacy, really turned things around. Just a special season, one that I think will be remembered for a long time, and one that's fun to go back and relive.
HBK.
My favorites. One quick last story. They were supposed to go on one of those late night talk shows. I can't remember which one, but they Hagelin relayed the story that they sent a plane. So they all met at the airport, and the plane was going to take them to New York to be on this national talk show, Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Fallon, or I can't remember which one. And they're on the tarmac, and Hagelin and Bonino are waiting there, and Kessel comes up, and he sees the plane. It's like very small, and Kessel goes, "I'm not getting on that thing." And Kessel just leaves and goes home. And Hagelin says he just left and went home and went to sleep, and we never saw him again. And then they didn't do the show. So that was just kind of like Phil Kessel is not here anymore, and he kind of had an expiration date on his time in Pittsburgh.
He's still a good hockey player, and he's apparently not a bad teammate.
Yeah, I don't think
he's just bad with the media. I mean, he's not really that bad of a teammate. It doesn't seem. He never quits on the team, or
I don't think he's nowhere near the class of.
And he's tough to catch. And that was another big thing about having Rick Tocchet is, and I think it played out more in the next season, like where Phil had a few more meltdowns. But Mark Bancroft's the jerk whisperer. And he really, for whatever reason, I don't know, it's just because Tocchet's like a tough guy. He could really somehow keep Kessel in line and check for those couple years until, I guess Rick Tocchet eventually, he left.
He did, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess Kessel went with him eventually to Arizona. So.
Yeah, I mean, Kessel was really good, and he was a little bit one-dimensional, and he kind of had his moments of, melting down, but he was nowhere near like an Antonio Brown. He wasn't that kind of guy.
He's kind of a discount like Ovechkin.
Yeah.
Like maybe not quite the goal scorer Ovechkin is, but Ovechkin at least checks people and stuff, though. I mean, he doesn't even do.
Yeah, Kessel's very, very one-dimensional.
Yeah.
Again, I was not opposed to when they finally said so long. And I think Phil Kessel, nobody holds any ill will. People,
No, we got 2 Stanley Cups out of him, and
Right.
I never felt like he quit on the team or anything.
no,
like
he'll
that.
be welcome
Yeah.
back here for the rest of his life. Like they
Yeah.
will trot him out 20 years
He
from
can
now.
he can eat hot dogs out of the Stanley Cup anytime he wants. And the best part is he went back to Toronto and did that.
Yeah, that was great. And even that there was that whole thing. Phil Kessel is a Stanley Cup champion.
Yeah.
And I think even Barack Obama, when they went to
Yeah.
the White House, that's what he says. The first thing he said. So that was kind of funny. So yeah, Kessel, all those guys, just a memorable team, memorable season. Any last thoughts?
No, just a great season and fun to reminisce about that. And Mike Sullivan definitely, I think, was the key piece that made it all come together. That was some, defensive trades and the acquiring Bonino, which is was an absolute steal for those 3 years. Shame they couldn't keep him beyond there, but like you said, that's what happened. The salary cap is like you just can't afford guys eventually.
Right.
And
Right.
he played him. The way he played, he paid himself into a nice little payday. Good for Nick Bonino, I guess.
He did. He did. Yeah. And yeah, that whole line's gone now. Hagelin's gone and Kessel and Bonino. But
Yeah.
man, they really made a difference in the time that they were here. Thanks everybody for listening. Please check us out wherever you get your podcasts. Please go to our website. It's pittsburghsportsmemories.weebly.com. We're also on Twitter. We're also on Facebook. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. That would be super nice. So thanks everybody for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for everybody listening in France.
Bonjour or au revoir.
Au revoir.